Chapter 11. Mr. Gurdjieff returned to Europe in the late 30s, and while I did not know it at the time, I was not to see him again for many years. I had been seeing him regularly in New York while he had been there, but I had not had much serious personal contact with him. Before he left, however, I had a long talk with him during which he reiterated the fact that it was proper for me to go out and experience the world, that whether I was aware of it or not, I had absorbed enough material, at least for the time being, and the important thing for me was to live life and put that material to use in whatever situations I might find myself. He did not specifically recommend that I disassociate myself from his work or from the American groups, but when I questioned him about that, he said that it was a question that would determine itself, that it was entirely up to me to do whatever I felt I should do about it. During the ensuing years, I did participate from time to time in group meetings and attend occasional readings of his books, but not for any long, sustained periods. In spite of this, there was no question of the influence which he still had over me. Rather like a child who considers a parent the final authority, I found that I never made any important decisions without at least attempting to consider them from the point of view of his teaching, and I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I tended to judge myself and others from a strongly moral and rather puritanical point of view. I was still young and relatively inexperienced, and my judgments were likely to be harsh and very stern. Whether this was a result of my association with Gurdjieff, who was more puritanical or righteous in many ways than one would imagine, or simply an outcropping of my puritanical Middle Western American background, I am not sure, but as time passed I began to feel that a great deal of it stemmed from an unconscious reaction against his authority and an equally unconscious attempt on my part to free myself from his powerful influence. In any case, it was a genuine struggle, complicated by my strong feelings about Gurdjieff as a man and, as it were, a parent, and my equally strong disapproval of the behavior of a great many of his followers. An example of this conflict in me was that while I rejected most of the followers and would not attend their meetings, I continued, almost without knowing it, to revere him personally. There could have been no better illustration of this than when I met P. D. Uspensky, his one-time student, who was conducting lectures and meetings in New York. I was told that he had announced a special series of lectures for persons who had, at any time, been associated with Mr. Gurdjieff, and, much against my better judgment, I was persuaded to attend the preliminary lecture, which was to be a sort of introduction to the series. A large group of Gurdjieff followers met Uspensky at an apartment in New York, where we listened to an interminable reading, quite incomprehensible to me, after which Mr. Uspensky announced that he would answer any questions that any one of us might have before we enrolled, or did not enroll, for the ensuing lecture series. Various questions were asked and answered, but the only question that was of any interest to me was, why had Uspensky broken with Gurdjieff and publicly disassociated himself from the Gurdjieff work? In order to clear up any possible confusion, I would like to point out that one rumor had it that Gurdjieff had dismissed Uspensky, but at the beginning of this preliminary lecture, Uspensky had stated that whatever we might have heard to the contrary, it was he who had left Gurdjieff. Gurdjieff, characteristically, had never said anything about the break, one way or the other. Uspensky smiled at the question and said that the answer was very simple. When he had found out that Gurdjieff was wrong, he had to leave him, adding that the details of this discovery would be covered in the lectures to follow. I replied, with much greater feeling than I would have expected of myself, that I did not need to hear any more. It was a revelation to me to find that I was so fiercely loyal to Gurdjieff, and to find that I was so positive that he could not have been wrong about anything. I did not attend any of Uspensky's future lectures, and those who did were only able to tell me that they had been very interesting and that I should not have missed them. Some years later, there was a reconciliation between the Gurdjieff and Uspensky factions, and I believe that Uspensky's books, especially In Search of the Miraculous, are recommended reading, are recommended as reading for prospective Gurdjieff students. I have no personal information about this reconciliation, as I was not present when it happened, and have had no contact with any Gurdjieff or other group for about 15 years. Ouspensky's books, especially In Search of the Miraculous and The Fourth Way, are unquestionably almost required reading for anyone interested in Gurdjieff. But it is perhaps needless to add that Gurdjieff's own published and unpublished books, assuming that one has sufficient interest and stick-to-itiveness to actually read them, are the only ones that give a real and undiluted flavor of the man and his teaching. Although I had championed Gurdjieff in the face of Mr. Ouspensky, my subsequent reaction to my own outburst took me somewhat by surprise. Although it only came over me very gradually, I was sick and tired of all the would-be messiahs, prophets, mystics, from Khalil Gibran and William Blake, always associated in my mind because of their drawings, up to and including Ouspensky, Gurdjieff, Buddha, and Jesus Christ himself. It was a good, healthy, and angry reaction, and it was, at least momentarily, liberating. However wise, all-seeing, and powerful these individuals might be, it was finally necessary, or so it seemed to me, to judge them by the more obvious and more hard-boiled truisms that they themselves sometimes quoted, birds of a feather, the company they keep, etc., as well as what now seemed to me to be an increasingly honest viewpoint. Their accomplishments in terms that they were comprehensible, if not quite likely, that I simply was not equipped to judge them. In other words, I was not a proper student for any philosophy, but the judgment had to be made for me. Since I was not making it for anyone else, it was not likely to have any far-reaching harmful or beneficial influence. I did not attempt to make any judgments about the dead. The main targets were the seers I had known myself. Ouspensky, I had known him at the Priory as well as during that brief encounter in New York, and Gurdjieff. I found that I did not know enough about Ouspensky to arrive at any conclusions of importance. I found, and find, tertium organum in A New Model for the Universe, and other writings of his wordy, over-intellectual, and generally incomprehensible, which is to say personally uninteresting, all of which is no judgment about their possible value. As to Gurdjieff, I found that I did not criticize him from the usual point of view. By that I simply mean that I was not at all disturbed about his lack of morals in the usual sense. It did not matter to me that he had illegitimate children, that he drank a great deal, or that he might have been a magician or a charlatan, or as he called himself, a devil. But if, in the final analysis, growth depended upon individual effort, if it was all up to you anyways, then why be a messiah? Who, besides Gurdjieff himself, thought or knew that he was chosen, or that he was unable to be anything other than a teacher? As an individual man, I knew him well enough to have very great genuine affection for him. As a teacher, well, that was a completely different question. I could not accept him in that role as I would accept the teaching which a parent gives to his child. It is a proper responsibility and an obvious one. The child is his, but as a leader of mankind, he must be, I concluded, just as fanatic and just as starstruck, although by something other than himself, as his pupils. Maybe, maybe not. My conclusions did not get me anywhere, except to conclude that I did not have the proper faith, or that I had not, in relation to Gurdjieff, seen the light. But it was a relief to have wrestled with the problem. In a curious sense, I ended up liking him, as a person, even more. He began to seem to me, in a very literal, paradoxical sense, the embodiment of that excellent phrase, a real genuine phony, that he, but not necessarily everyone else, grew in such a way that the evil and the good within him progressed equally. I accepted wholeheartedly, but not for myself. I was on the side of something, even if I didn't know what it was. I wanted to believe in good, and I wanted to fight for it. I suppose it was something like suddenly finding out that you believe in God. This state of being of mine did not last for very long. The simple fact of World War II put an end to most of my feelings, in fact to almost any religious feelings in me, but even so, it was near the end of the war that I had my most shattering and important contact with Gurdjieff.